Welcome everybody to this RSA session for the Samuel Johnson Prize, which is essentially dedicated to the idea that truth isn't just stranger than fiction, it's better than it. There will be novelists who object to that, but in this room, in this company, that proposition is incontrovertible tonight. That's what we're going with. Welcome to the live audience as well. This is being streamed so that people are listening to it on the internet or following it on the internet. You at home don't have to put your phones on silent. I think that would be too intrusive. But we'd be very grateful if you would hear, because we are being filmed. If you want to comment or disagree or just kind of type out some inchoate screech of rage, the Twitter hashtag is #SJPrize. And obviously, unless you've come into the wrong room completely, I don't need to tell you that that's the Samuel Johnson Prize. It's in its 16th year now, the prize. And since it was first handed out in 1999, the first prize winner was Anthony Beevor with Stalingrad. It's established itself as really the preeminent prize for non-fiction books. That may have something to do with the fact that the prize winner gets £20,000, but I think it's mostly to do with the fact that the judges for the prize are always people who know how hard it is to achieve excellence in non-fiction. This year is no exception. The chair of the prize this year is Claire Tomlin, an award-winning biographer. On her panel, she has Alan Johnson, who won the Orwell Prize for his book This Boy. She's got Ray Monk, who won several awards for his biography of Wittgenstein. So they're people who know how difficult it is to get to this stage. We're very lucky to have almost a full house for you today. We are missing one person. Greg Grandin, whose book The Empire of Necessity is about a slave rebellion off the Chile coast. He can't be here tonight. He's flying in tomorrow for the award ceremony, but we have everybody else. And they are, in order, John Campbell, who's here to talk about his biography of Roy Jenkins, A Well-Rounded Life. Next to him, Alison Light. She's here to talk about her book, Common People, which is an account of family history and much more. Caroline Morehead, who tells an extraordinary story of resistance in a very remote part of France in her book, Village of Secrets. Marion Coutts, whose book is about her husband's terminal illness. Her book is The Iceberg. And then finally, Helen MacDonald, her book, H is for Hawk, also about grief in a way, but also about the experience of training a goshawk. It's immediately apparent. I haven't even touched on the richness and complexity of these books in those very short descriptions, but I hope we're going to get into it a little bit now. And what we're going to do is we're going to hear readings from all of the books, and then I will talk directly to each author in turn. And then we will throw it open to you, so you can ask the blazingly obvious question, which I've somehow forgotten to ask at the end. And because I don't want to cut into that time, we're going to start straight away. John, perhaps you could start reading.
Start with the reading.
Yes.
Okay, thank you. Roy Jenkins' 2 years at the Home Office, actually less than 2 years, are a classic example of the right man in the right job at the right time. Half a century later, his brief tenure still excites admiration and controversy in equal measure. Coinciding with the height of Beatlemania, the miniskirt, the contraceptive pill, and swinging London, but also with the Rolling Stones, the drug scene, and the first Vietnam War demonstrations, the period 1965 to 67 now appears, for good or ill, a turning point in the social history of the country, a halcyon time of personal liberation or the onset of national decadence. Of course, Jenkins did not create, but only reflected, the new moral climate which 20 years of peace and growing affluence suddenly produced in the mid-60s. But he was far more in tune with the changing times than most Home Secretaries. He was openly on the side of the youth revolution, not against it. And if a 45-year-old balding politician could hardly be its patron saint, he was certainly its benevolent sponsor.
Thank you, John. Anybody who's read your biography will know that he was not just interested in the permissive society in theory, Roy Jenkins. He put it into practice to a certain degree. Your book is an official biography. That can sometimes mean a lack of candour. It's absolutely not the case here. What was your access to information?
Oh, I had complete access to information. I was very fortunate. I've written biographies before, but never an official biography. This time I was appointed by Jennifer Jenkins and given full access to Roy Jenkins' papers, which were then still housed in the attic of their house in East Hendred. So I had full access to that.
And did you have any misgivings about it being an official biography?
Not really, no. I knew that, Jenkins himself was a biographer. His family knew what biography involved. Jenkins, in his own book reviews of other people's biographies, it was always hard on authors who glossed over the personal side. I think I knew, Jennifer Jenkins knew, that there were aspects of his life which I think she probably hoped I wouldn't make too much of, but I couldn't gloss them over. I don't think I have sensationalized them, but I have given them full weight. They were a very important part of his life, and I have reflected that, I hope, in a well-rounded life.
But it's interesting that you felt that, as it were, your subject himself gave you license by his own biographical method.
I think very much so, yes. I think, it's interesting. It's a biography of a biographer, to some extent.
It has a fascinating early passage about his friendship with Tony Crossland. And that's one of those points at which you have to kind of choose how far you go. It was clearly a friendship that was very, very intense, and to some degree sexual as well.
I think to a small degree sexual. I don't think it should be exaggerated. I think there was a certain amount of bisexuality going on at Oxford in that time. Tony Crossland was quite openly, I think, gay. Obviously, Roy very definitely was not, but he had this very intense adolescent, rather as the Daily Telegraph, somebody in the Telegraph quite rightly said, it was a very Brideshead. It was very Sebastian Flight. But it was very political. They were arguing about socialism and fascism and the class war. Roy was 2 years younger than Tony Crossland, was very much at that stage under his influence. So there may have been. It was quite an intense relationship. You've seen, we've got mainly Tony's letters rather than Roy's, but he does address Tony as my angel, my pet, and things which even for the standards of the time, I think is going slightly further than normal friendship.
And Roy Jenkins sort of confessed that he'd been seduced once.
He did.
To a friend,
He did. I haven't revealed my source on that one, but he did confess that something may have happened once. But I really do not think this should be taken out of context and treated as a great revelation. And the fact that he was legalizing homosexuality in the 1967 because he was thinking of himself.
Well, you've gone ahead of my next question, but right. It must have been part of the context, mustn't it? That he had a different sense of what it was to, how a kind of social liberalism could work. It must have fit into his thinking.
Yes, but I think they all, in the debates about homosexuality in the 60s and no one ever admitted to knowing a homosexual, and yet obviously they all did. But it was all it was not talked about. But they all knew that there was something that a lot of perfectly decent people that they all knew were being treated as a criminal offence and had to be legalised. I don't think he was more anxious to do it for his own personal reasons. It was part of the same thing. He had no personal interest in the abortion bill. He wasn't particularly interested in theatre censorship. He went, but he could see that these were archaic laws that were making Britain in the 1960s ridiculous and Victorian and needed to be swept away. And he had this agenda of all these things that he wanted to do, which he'd been campaigning for since the 50s. And fortunately, he was Home Secretary at just the right time to be able to push that agenda through. And he did, as I say, a remarkable amount in a very short time.
He was held responsible by a lot of politicians who came after, and they blamed him, in effect, for sort of opening Pandora's box. Do you think he was, or he was just in the right place at the right time, and he was sufficiently efficient to get it through?
Well, I think it took a lot of determination and skill of him to get it through. I mean, both the homosexuality and abortion things he didn't do as government bills. He picked up private members' bills that were introduced by Leo Abse on the one hand and David Steele on the other. But they would not have got through. Like most private members' bills, they would have died a death if it hadn't been for the government giving them time. And Jenkins had to fight in Cabinet. Cabinet was pretty reluctant to put through either of those things, but he had to fight to get the government time for them. So I think it was necessary that somebody with that persistence, and I mean a lot of credit to Harold Wilson as well, who wasn't particularly keen on either of them, but knew when he appointed Jenkins to the Home Office that this was what he wanted to do and supported him in doing them. And I think that, credit is due to Wilson as well, but it was Jenkins who really pushed them through.
The other great set piece of your book is the SDP, obviously, and the founding of the SDP. You obviously admire him as a character, and there is much to admire. I mean, he's witty, he is talented, he's hardworking, contrary to the rumours about his laziness. You find him guilty of prevarication over exactly how far they were going to go in the SDP and the Liberal link. I wondered what you felt was his greatest failing as a politician.
His greatest failure as a politician was that I suppose he did rather... I mean, as leader, he wasn't a good leader of the SDP. Once he was very brave and clear-sighted and courageous in setting the thing up. He wasn't very good as a party leader. He wasn't good, and he wouldn't have been very good probably if he'd ever become leader of the Labour Party. He wasn't good at the nitty-gritty of party management. He was good at making big speeches. He was decisive as a minister. He wasn't really good at what you might call low politics. And I think he was very sociable among his friends. He was actually fairly shy with people he didn't know. And he wasn't good at the sort of backslapping side of political leadership.
He was pretty good for a shy man, though, wasn't he? I mean, you write this wonderful sentence. The two most important girlfriends of his middle and later years were the wives of two of his best friends. In the upper-class society of the 50s and 60s, this was not unusual. It must have been a tiny bit unusual, surely. Your best friends?
Well, all I can say, it is quite difficult to explain this to a younger generation, I think, but it is the case that this was not something that made great waves among the society he moved in. Everybody knew of this. Nobody talked about it. I have had it explained to me directly that the philosophy was that you only had affairs within strong marriages. So there were no broken marriages, no broken hearts, no scandal. And as long as there was no scandal, I think he wasn't the only one who was doing this sort of thing. If you think about it, most of the, people say, how did this not get into the newspapers? If you think of most of the recent political scandals of recent years, of Cecil Parkinson or David Blunkett or anyone, it's usually an aggrieved partner, usually the woman, who goes to the press and makes a story. If nobody goes to the press with the story, there isn't a scandal. And in Jenkins' case, it was in nobody's interest to make a scandal out of it, and there was no scandal. And Jennifer accepted this as long as there was no scandal.
To put it crudely, he always dallied upwards, didn't he, up the social ladder, which led to him being accused of being a social climber and having betrayed his roots. Do you think he was a social climber? What was the nature of his fascination with?
A lot of the nature of his fascination was historical, actually. As a historian and biographer who had written a lot about the Edwardian and Victorian periods, he loved the sort of resonance of ancient names and titles. I don't think he was interested in boring aristocrats. He was interested in the interesting ones, but I don't think he was a social climber per se. And I do deny that he really... obviously his father was a coal miner, so there was a great social mobility. But by the time Roy Jenkins was born, his father was already a councillor, a high union official, all the rest of it. He was MP for Pontypool by the time Roy Jenkins was 15. He was then Attlee's PPS during the war when he was Deputy Prime Minister. Jenkins grew up in the heart of the Labour Party, in the heart of what was becoming a governing establishment. And he didn't think there was any sense of betrayal. My first chapter is called His Father's Son. He was very much, the ambition, the social climbing, in a sense, was done by his father, not by Roy. So I don't think there's any betrayal of class roots at all.
That gives me a cue to move on, because I want to move on to Alison Light, because your book, Common People, in a sense, is about people mostly who don't, as it were, leave their roots behind, who remain within it, and because of that, their history gets a little bit lost. Could you read us a passage first? Or if you might want to disagree with my description of it first.
Can I start by disagreeing?
Yes, you can.
It's always a good
I saw
move.
the look on your
Always
face.
a good move. Well, only with the idea that they didn't leave their roots, because in fact they all left, and most of the people in the book are migrants who constantly are moving
Yes,
around.
they are moving, but not moving necessarily socially in huge degrees.
Yeah, no, that's absolutely right. I thought I'd read a bit from the end of the book, which I hope doesn't give too much away, but it's a bit of a summary. I'll just introduce it with another little bit, and then it's when I'm reflecting, because I try to break up rather precisely some of the social history with moments of reflection, as well as with memoir. I remember exactly when the idea for this book seeded itself. It began with a vision. I was on a train between London and Newcastle, glancing out of the window across the wide open fields of Lincolnshire. The fields were empty, not even a solitary farmer on a tractor, and suddenly I had a sense of how crowded and peopled those acres would have been in earlier centuries. And all at once a swarm of ghosts, nameless, their faces blurred with time, filled my mind. Doing family history, I found that I stood a tiny figure on a jetty or a pier, and stretching far to the horizon before me was the prospect of an infinite past, like an ever-moving sea, rolling toward me and receding. I understand more now why my family seemed to come from nowhere and had nothing. I thought I might find an ancestral place, but what I found was movement. I'm as English as they come, the descendant of migrants from all over the southern counties, Ireland too, and beyond. I've learnt whom I come from. Farm workers and lace makers, carters and caulkers, women who made needles and plied them, saddlers and stay makers, old ladies who washed sailors' rig-outs, young ones who sorted paper and rags, bricklayers and builders, and so many servants. Those who sailed to sea, who fed the engines and the men, shopkeepers and milk boys, paraffin sellers, barmaids, watermen, lifters and loaders and porters, and people who made everything from shirts to churches and the roads they walked away on. Their history is local, national and global as they went about their world, finding work, dreaming their dreams. Southern England was hard hit. Enclosures of land, workhouses and the pauperisation of the labourers drove many out onto the road, and this too is our island story, the other face of the Industrial Revolution, which produced losers as well as winners in a modernising capitalist economy.
Thank you. I like that image that you began with of looking out of the train window at an empty field, because in a sense that's where the book starts, with the sense that your own family history stops very soon, yes. I suppose. What's amazing is how much you can then discover without, as it were, an inherited family history. Were you surprised by?
I was absolutely astonished. I'm not trained as a professional historian. I've never taught history, and I began the book as in an amateur way, as one does, just with a question of wondering whether I would find things, because my family was particularly truncated. My grandmother had been an orphan. My mother didn't know who her grandparents were on either side, really. And on my father's side, his father had moved from Birmingham, and we had no contact with his family. So And like, I think, probably lots of people here tonight, you know, there were no photographs, there were no oil paintings, there were no documents, there were no diaries, no letters, no objects passed on, and no graves. And although I couldn't replace some of those things, it was very heartening, actually, how much we leave behind. There was no one who hadn't left a trace, no one. And even if that trace was in an official record of an asylum, it was very resonant to me. And sometimes all you need is a name with a fact alongside it. And that, you know, it might be the name. I found a lot of women who were in the mental asylum in Portsmouth, where a lot of my family ended up and where I grew up, and they had come from all over the world. So it would be somebody like Lily Jenkins, Ireland, Isle, West Indies, 3 children dead. And each one was like a little novel in miniature, really. I was inundated with material. The problem was to select and shape.
You make the point very well that because sort of formal records or official records tend to concentrate on the beginning of a life and the end of a life, you often get a very distorted account, particularly in the case of lives that have ended in poverty, which many lives did before the welfare state. I mean, that was a destiny.
Nice to hear you using that phrase, as you know, it still exists.
Well, yes, I hope it and will continue to exist. But you very pointedly make the point that it's not enough to say they died in the workhouse, that the richness of a life lies somewhere else.
Yes, absolutely. I mean, there's a lot of sadness in the book, a lot of hardship, but there's also a huge amount of resilience and resourcefulness. And I think because this kind of family history can't be biography, you also, you're constantly surprised, actually, by the information you do find. So when I was looking at one of my grandmothers, who I didn't know, my father's mother, I just had her birth and her death, and then gradually I found out what she did during the First World War. And of course, and she was in the Women's Forage Corps, which is very little known about now. And they were the women who baled up all the hay and all the fodder. So they're the women behind the men behind Warhorse, if you like. And there's a complicated reason, which I won't go into, as to why they've largely disappeared from the story. But she had a fantastic time during the war. They led a very gypsy life, moving around with lads from the army. And I wanted to find a way of writing that wouldn't make death the destination of the story. Because I don't actually believe it is. I don't think our death tells us about our lives. It's not full of life, as it were. So I had to play with that quite a lot, but I also had to be very frank about not knowing things. There was no point in pretending, actually, I thought.
Oddly, though, there was sometimes a paradoxical effect when you did know things. I mean, you write family history, which humanizes those who might otherwise be mere faces in a crowd, also defamiliarized those closest to me. Yeah. Because it knitted them back into a social history.
Yes, I mean, if you do this sort of work, I think the phrase I used was killjoy. You start off maybe thinking this might be for your family, and then you realize that the people have to become part of the fabric of history, and that, like all of us, they're not wholly in control of their lives, and they're representative. It doesn't mean they're types, but they then become distant, and the things you find out are often not what family might want to know as well. So I think, one enters, you have to keep very open about that.
Well, you repeatedly come back to family myths, which you then,
yes,
which have a charm
beloved
to them, and
stories.
And then you come along and say, well, I'm sorry, but it's just not the case.
Yes.
But not always because they're trying to hide a social shame, but sometimes simply because people want a more interesting story.
Well, I think probably we all want a more interesting story than our story, the story that we have. I mean, which of us in the room hasn't talked him or herself up at some point? And I think that's also because we are our fantasies. So I tried in the book, where I could, to talk about the stories I'd heard a story from my grandfather, my mother's father, that it's a very classic English story, that they had fallen on hard times, that we came from a bit of wealth somewhere, there'd been some trouble in the family, he was disinherited, very familiar story. And his mother was never mentioned, my grandfather's mother, we didn't know her name, she was never mentioned. And it turned out that she had died in a mental asylum. So of course the story was in part, I believe, to hide a sense of terrible shame. It was a pauper's asylum. But also I think it gave him power to tell the story. He could reinvent himself. That's what storytelling does. It gives us all scope and room. That's what all the people here have been doing, I think. So I wanted to give the stories credit, not just debunk, really.
You write this, sometimes I wondered what family history was, if not extended mourning. Is it partly a mourning for yourself as well, for ourselves? The knowledge that, as you read this, that we too will one day come down to an entry in a ledger, and did it leave you feeling a little melancholy, the experience of writing this book?
Well, I'm slightly inclined to melancholy, as well as humour. I think they tend to go together, the old gallows humour. I think it was partly that. I think it's sobering. I think it's very sobering to look across generations, and I talk about how family history is a very bizarre way of doing history, because you look across generations in a morning, you go at high speed, like the Grim Reaper, you're watching things generation after generation, and you're going backwards. So you're also watching cities fall away to fields. It's a very interesting way of working, but it's also a sobering one. It puts you in perspective. It brings you up against the facts of life. But I think also it's mournful because you're brought back round to where you started, I think, and you realise your own ignorance about your elders. You wish you'd asked them things when they were alive. You wish you'd listened. And I think I was very intrigued by the notion of ancestors, that word, which is also a very powerful, slightly ritualistic word.
You use this very interesting phrase, which I think family historians use a lot, ego documents. John Campbell, you had lots of ego documents for your book. You had almost no ego documents, meaning letters, diaries.
Yes.
I wonder what you felt about life now. The selfie, the Facebook account,
Yes.
the Twitter feed. We are living in the most documented time ever for ordinary people.
And the most throwaway time. Don't you think it's, other people could speak to this better than me, it's a very good question. From the historian's point of view, I think it must be very frustrating because there's this plethora of material and recording devices of all kinds, but we don't keep it.
No. Whereas
how many of us, I remember I used to print my emails. In the old days, you printed out every email you got. It was so rare. So I think it's complicated. It's a virtual world of documents. And how we're going to preserve that, I'm glad that's not my job to worry about that. It is very peculiar. It's both a very self-centered world in a positive way, and it's also evanescent.
Caroline Morehead, I want to turn to you now because you're writing again about people who were not terribly well known, to a certain extent marginal. There were some people who were well known. Your book is about an area of France which became famous essentially for protecting and rescuing and saving Jewish children. Just tell me, first of all, how did you come about on the story? Was it out of the research of your previous book?
It was, yes.
Because you'd written a Train in Winter, which was about resistance women being deported.
And that ended in January. They'd all left France by January 1943. So I wanted a story that would take me from then until the end of the war. And I also, at that point, laughingly thought that I wanted a story where everybody behaved beautifully. And in fact, the moment I started research, I saw that it was a very complicated story. And in order to write about the saving, I had to write about Vichy France. So the first third of the book is what Vichy France was doing to the resistors, the communists, the Jews. And the second two thirds are about this plateau where these people were all saved. And then also underlying it all is the fact that there is a myth about the whole place. So it's on several levels.
Perhaps you can read us a little bit before we talk in more detail
I'll
about
just
that.
read a bit about when they're up on the plateau. Bonnie was constantly conscious of the hunger of his 75 small charges. Foraging had become part of daily life. Frogs caught in the fields were a necessary delicacy. Nor was it only food that was lacking. Few of the children arrived with clothes to grow into. As they became taller, clothes were handed down from child to child, trousers and shirts and sweaters increasingly bleached and threadbare as time passed. Hannah, who could sew, spent hours patching and mending. In Faidoli, a third house opened by Secours Suisse, Bonnie divided the children into 4 teams: lions, tigers, eagles and squirrels, and each took turns at cooking, washing and taking the handcart several kilometres down to the village to collect supplies. To keep warm, the children wore many layers of ill-assorted clothes, which gave them a rugged, unkempt look. A signal had been devised. When all was safe, the Swiss flag flew over Faidoli, La Brique and La Gaspé. If the flags were lowered, it meant the children had to hide. And this is just something on one of the children. A boy called Peter Fegel started a diary addressed à mes chers parents. Photographs of his mother and father were stuck into the small black notebook, and he surrounded them with borders patterned in coloured ink. Day after day he wrote, "I am anxious, I am worried. I fear for you, my dear parents. Still nothing from you." On the 13th of September, he heard that they'd been taken to Drancy, the camp outside Paris. After that, nothing. Now, every day he wrote, "No news of you, no news of you," again and again. He also wrote about trying to get into contact with the Red Cross, the Quakers, and about getting himself to Marseille or to America. And then the entries stopped. When they resumed in 1944, there was no more mention of his parents.
You say at the beginning of the book that it's partly a book about the fallibility of memory. What did you mean by that? That was you're essentially thinking you're going to write a book about good behaviour and you find something different.
I think very early on, I was warned by a number of historians in France that far from being a story about goodness, this was a hornet's nest. I chose not really to believe this because it seemed to me that it was a story in which everybody had chosen to behave so well. And as I started my research and talked to groups of people, they would say to me, "Who are you going to talk to?" And I would give a name and they'd say, "Oh God, you can't talk to them. You know, they've just made the whole thing up." And I became aware very quickly that a number of different groups of people involved with the story, the savers, the saved, the Catholics, the Protestants, the Maquis, the pacifists, had all taken in little groups possession of the story and made their events their own. And foolishly, I think, I didn't realize what trouble this would get me into because I tried to sort of steer a course. But there was one particular group who were the sort of heart of the sort of hard core of the story, led by a man comically called Sauvage. And he was a pacifist. And he has been incredibly critical because his view of this history, his view of what I saw as the truth, is very different. And they are very critical of anybody who doesn't tell their story as they saw it, which of course leads one to reflect on the fact that history is so fluid but at the same time calcified. It's both those things at the same time. And also to think about Vichy. Now, the poison that Vichy spread incredibly seems to have even gone into the good stories.
One should say that although you don't give a haloed myth, I mean that's what you essentially undercut.
Yes.
This stained glass window with its simplification. But it is a story about people behaving well, and it's a story about sort of moral courage in the face of
Definitely.
real and very much a Protestant courage. Was that crucial to it?
It was very important to it.
I mean, they were essentially non-conformists, so
They
they'd
were
been
non-conformist.
tutored in...
Exactly. They were Huguenots. They were descendants from the Huguenots. And this particular plateau was where a lot of Huguenots had taken refuge during the French Wars of Religion. And also, most importantly, it was home to a large community of people called Darbistes, who were the descendants of John Darby, who was a member of the Plymouth Brethren. And he passed that way in 1830. And they're somewhere between Amish and Quaker. And they lived very retired from the world in big families on isolated farms. And as more and more people hearing what was going on the plateau began to arrive, they simply absorbed them into their farms. But when the war came to an end, and later in the 50s and 60s, when people started to take ownership of this story, the Darbistes were left out. And it is not until the last 10 years or so that it's begun to emerge what a huge part they played.
It wasn't just the Darbistes, was it? Because there's also the Ravenists. It's very interesting that you've got this, this way of being in the world which is both about setting yourself apart from a kind of authority,
yes,
but is also massively schismatic.
It is.
So that at the moment they can have a row with somebody, they go over the hill and set up another sect.
Exactly. So it was like that. It was a series of sort of confined groups of people who didn't mix very much. For instance, this main group of pacifists, of course, were outraged when the resistance, the armed maquisards, started doing some rescuing themselves, because they thought that it was only to do with non-violence rescuing people. And that was another of the fault lines.
Who did that stained glass window serve mostly? Was it the French after the war that it provided the most?
Absolutely. I mean, after the war, when they were looking for, when France was desperately seeking good examples of people who had stood out against the Vichy government, this area began to emerge as this wonderful place where goodness was done. And this went on. I mean, Chirac praised it as the foremost place in France where people had been saved. So a sort of little aura of glory and goodness has pervaded the myth. The trouble is, it's made up of a lot of snakes.
I mean, they're kind of admirable snakes, though, aren't they? I mean, what's wonderful about it is, not all of them. I mean, I think that's the melancholy thread through your book, is that the children are saved, they are looked after, but it's without great tenderness in many cases.
Yes.
I mean, there's a stern rigour to
Absolutely.
it. So they're saved because they are the chosen people. It's a scriptural duty to do it, but
you don't have to love them or be nice to them.
apart from Father Trotney, who does seem to have been rather loving and...
In his own way.
Oh, you don't. You've worked as well as a human rights activist. Do you see writing as a branch of that, writing about events like this as a kind of extension or another way of doing that work, bringing attention to these occasions?
I haven't really thought of it that way. I think you may be drawn to melancholy. I think I'm drawn to the black side of life. I constantly want to write about how people survive the unsurvivable. And that is true in human rights, as it is in these stories of resistance.
And have you come to any conclusion? Because you have written very often about people in adversity.
No, I just
There's no
again and again and again.
But it is this, I mean, the characters that I thought were absolutely fascinating in your book, I mean, they're all the French characters there, but these extraordinary, an English woman, Gladys Maber, and an American woman, Virginia Hall.
Yes.
I mean, one of the things that's odd, I think, for anybody who has a sort of rough knowledge of the war is you think of France as being occupied, but here is this English woman. She's there all the way through the war, partly because she's in Vichy France at the beginning, so she has this strange, ambiguous status. Yep. And the American Virginia Hall, a one-legged OSS.
SOE, yes. And she couldn't be dropped in because he only had one leg. And so she was brought in on a submarine. And the person she was in touch with in England, her mentor, as it were, didn't know that she called her wooden leg Caspar. So when she emailed back, or she radioed back, Cuthbert is giving trouble, she got the answer to say, eliminate him.
She was wonderful, I thought, and always, but sort of very tempting as a writer to get diverted. I don't know quite how you have the discipline to withdraw from such characters.
Well, there were so many wonderful characters. I mean, it was a case of sort of charting my way between them.
And was it the isolation that allowed that character to flourish, do you think, up on this? Because there were,
Absolutely.
I mean, the other thing we should say about it was this plateau, I mean, during winter was effectively cut off because
Absolutely
the snow would, and weren't many roads in.
No.
There was a single little railway, but again, that would stop in winter.
Stop in the winter. That did make a great difference. And of course, the roads weren't made up, so difficult to get up there, and rainy weather as well, and so on. And it was very confined. It was this little plateau, very high in the mountains, sort of cut off from everything else.
You didn't get I think, I don't know whether it's still true, but you didn't get a French translator for A Train in Winter.
I have not. It's
Oh,
just
you
coming
have
out.
now. And have you got a publisher for this book?
Not yet. And I'm rather hoping that I may not get one.
Well, I hope you do. They should read it. Marion, I want to turn to you now. A different kind of resistance, a different kind of ordeal. Your book, The Iceberg. Could you read us a little extract first?
Sure.
It is the dead, the straight dead of night, and I have brought my subject and my object, the one who this is all about, into the hospital. He is wheezing, his face is florid and jowly, wrapped in a scarf and hat, and his temperature has tripped over the killer number, 38. 38 means a phone call, an immediate hospitalization, but we are okay. We are more than okay. We are delirious, in a high humor. It feels like a mad road trip, barking. A silky night rain is falling as ever on the elephant. Once out of the car, we try one of the hospital wheelchairs, but it's an abused thing, like a shopping trolley fit only for the bottom of the river. I can't unstick the brake, then I do. And I can't steer it, then I do. And now upstairs, I can't push one side of the double door to get us into the ward where he is expected. We are unable to maneuver, damned with all his weight listing to one side. And as I reverse for another assault, I see the silhouette of the faraway nurse, illumined through the glass like a Vermeer maid at the end of a quiet corridor, reach down to press a button. I am through. Tom stretches the crook of his stick towards me as a falling man grabs for a branch, and I pull him in after me just as the heavy doors move to close. His eyes have a full-on wicked glaze. He's enjoying me going bum ways in, laughing at the ridiculous, impenetrable doors that thwart the weak, at the deadness of the night, and the great adventure of it all, another episode in our adventure of being and dying. When the tests start up, the nurses suddenly accelerate. I gauge the danger from their speed. This is serious. We should have come in earlier. Later, we talk to the night doctor. He introduces me to her. This is my friend.
Thank you. It's a very kind of characteristic passage, I think, because it mixes grave and sort of mortal fears with a sense of the comedy of it. Could you tell us about the process of writing the book? You began writing it in 2009, didn't you? Is that right?
Probably, yes.
And you were writing in the thick of events, but did you know you were writing a book then?
Not at all, no. It kind of started out as essentially these tiny bunches of words, just sort of grouped around things noticed or ideas or, I don't know, just descriptions. There was so much to pay attention to, and in a way it was just a way of like pinpointing things. And I suppose I kind of kept these bunches of words in my head, and then I started to think of them as kind of chains of text, and I started to realize that I could join them up. But it wasn't a book at all, and then at a certain point I realized that it was a book, and then that was a sort of, I don't know, that was a kind of relief. Because I knew, I don't know, from that point on, I knew what I was doing with it in a fine way.
Presumably you can't have written it chronologically. You can't have written it as we read it.
No, it was very much written anti-chronologically. I mean, we were very, very against linearity. We were very against chronology. We knew what was going to happen. So it was all out of order. And at first I thought, once I realized it was a book, I thought, okay, I'm going to write it as an anti-chronological book. I'm going to write it almost like a shuffle book, because it's written in these numbered sections ranging from about 300 words to something like 3,000 words. So in a sense, you could deal with it how you pleased. But then At a certain point, I thought, no, it's got enough breaks, it's got enough intervals, it's got enough anti-linear elements, and in fact it does need to be in order. And that just took the longest time, because of course some sections are, I don't know, can span sort of 6 months, and then another section can be about 6 hours, and the 6 hours might take place within the 6 months. So what do you do with that? So that really was quite a major work at a certain point, how to orchestrate it, where to put it all.
And was that work a process of editing out or a process of addition? Were you having to write, as it were, binding material to hold all of that together?
Tom died in January 2011, and really it was just these sort of condensed fragments. But I don't know, the sort of process, I knew how to expand them, and there was quite a lot of expansion, but there was also a lot of stuff that got chucked out. I mean, the whole, there was a sort of, that was rather an interesting thing to discover about how you could edit, you could get rid of things, you could move things around. Because of course a book, which I hadn't known before, because I've never written a book before, is a kind of place of power in a way. You can do what you like with it. These are the words. You can change them around. And obviously the book nothing in the book is made up, but at the same time it's of course completely made, it's completely constructed. And that's a really rather amazing thing that I hadn't known,
The book is written in the present tense, and it has a very kind of immediate sense of what you're feeling at the moment. You're experiencing those events. Were there any pieces of writing that you came back and you disavowed, that you thought, actually, I was wrong to think that, or were you being
You mean
true
of the original
fragments? Yeah.
No, absolutely nothing, actually. I mean, there was tons of writing that happened after, and you had to sort of, like I say, certain bits were edited out. I mean, if that's what you mean, then yes, certain things went. For example, there were sort of long ranting passages against certain people or against certain things that happened. And it sort of became clear that actually to include those things would really skew everything. It's not a kind of, that's not what the book's about. You can have sort of real fury against certain institutions or against the way, certain things happened or whatever. But I think the anger went into the language and became very embedded in the language and in how it sounds. But actually it wasn't the time to go crashing down, in that way.
How wary were you about writing this kind of memoir? It is now a genre, or it can be seen as a genre, or pigeonholed as a genre. And the language of mourning and the language of illness are very hotly contested. I mean, Susan Sontag and lots of others since. Did you have your own rules about how you were going to approach it?
No. I didn't really want it to be called a memoir. I didn't think of it as a memoir. I had the idea that it was to call it not a novel, somehow, because it reads like a novel, but it's not a novel. I don't know, the thing that interested me was the sort of the physicality and the agency of the words and what you can make them do. I mean, I didn't set out at all, I wasn't even remotely thinking of writing a sort of a narrative in the sense that this is what happened to us, a sort of grief narrative. But words were completely at issue for us. I mean, Tom's illness was a brain tumor. It was in the area of speech and language. He was losing words. He was a writer. He was a very good writer. He was a very serious writer, a very funny writer. But he was very focused on making things exactly right with words. So it just seemed like the rules were to be as exactly accurate with words as I possibly could. And whatever that took was what that took, So yeah, I don't know if that answers your question.
It does, yes. The book, as it was reviewed, and I think this is sort of emerges out of the solipsism of most readers, that we read the book, we think about death, we think about our own death. It conceals the fact that almost as much of the book is about a child growing up.
Yeah. We were a trio. He was hugely implicated in everything. And I think it's very important to sort of, I don't know, it seems to me that children have a huge capacity to understand just all the stuff you might give them to understand if you do it right. You know, you have to guide them, you have to obviously be careful about it. But there was never any sense that he would be pushed out of the way when things got bad. Because things were just bad all the time, you know, it was just bad. And he was our child, and he was with us, and I wasn't going to send him away. So it's as much about his sort of growth and his, I mean, there's just tons of stuff about his language development, and how joyous that was, and how particular that was, and how much fun we had with that, you know, and Tom had fun with that, and I had fun with that, and, you know, he had fun with that.
You also write, to a certain degree, about having fun with Tom's failing language. I mean, I visited sometimes, and he would enjoy this rather painful process of trying to find the right word. Or
well, he was kind of, it was a very, just there was so much sort of complexity about it, and it was such an odd, I mean, what was happening to consciousness was, you know, his language was going, we were right up against the rocks of it all, you know, it was just disappearing. Yet at the same time, he wasn't going, you know, and his identity wasn't taken. And he could just sort of handle it. You know, he was a great improviser. He was a great sort of, he was very fearless in how he was, you know. And in a way, when brain cancer came along, that's obviously something really to fear. But at the same time, it just seemed like he could do as he pleased. And that isn't to say that he didn't have fear. I mean, we did have huge fear, but at the same time, fear is something you can look at, just like anything else, really.
He remained a reader to the end, and there are a lot of allusions to books and to reading, and to him calling for poetry and so on. Were there any books or literature that kind of you had in mind as an exemplar or a model, or did you think, I'm going to write this, as it were, you know, from the beginning, out of nothing?
I think I wrote it from the beginning out of nothing. I mean, it's a very visual book. It's full of art. You know, my experience of making work is of making physical objects. I'm a sculptor. I work with film and video and photography. I think about what things look like and what things feel like. And in a way, that was as much a kind of force in the making of the book. You know, I thought of the sections, the individual sections, and when I started to describe them to other people, I said, I've written this book, it's in these individual sections, and each section is like a different physical object. You know, it has a sort of patina or a shape or a weight or a feel, and one is like this and one is like this. You know, it's a very kind of concrete thing. So in a way, that was a way I could look at the material and understand, yes, this bit is like this kind of is to do with this means this, and then this comes over here. So it's kind of very...
So you were thinking of it sculpturally, or
in terms of, what it felt like. What does a book feel like? What is that? It's a water jug feel like? I've got no idea. You know, what does it feel like? And because that sort of, in a way, that sort of intimacy about looking really runs through the whole book, I think. You know, what is it to see? What is it to see when you know you're going to stop seeing? I mean, all that is very kind of vital, I think, in the book.
It's a good cue, I think, to turn to you, Helen MacDonald. You're very, very much concerned also with accuracy of vision and seeing things clearly. I mean, your book emerges from grief too, but grief after a death.
I think a very different grief. And the death of a parent obviously is meant to be part of a natural order of things, but it hit me very hard. We were very, very good friends, my father and I. We were both terrible anoraks. He was obsessed with aeroplanes, I was obsessed with birds, and we'd go off when I was a child and sort of hunt mushrooms and spot birds and stuff like that. You know, he was just suddenly gone, and that was a real rent in the world. And I coped with it in a very unusual way, one that I don't recommend, by the way. I don't recommend buying a goshawk as a way of coping with bereavement. So I'm going to read a bit about the moment when I drive up. I order a goshawk on the internet. That sounds terrible. I did know the person I was buying it from, who lived near Belfast, so I drove up hundreds of miles to Stranraer and wandered around on a quayside with a can of Red Bull and very messy hair in the wind, waiting for my goshawk to arrive. And this chap arrived with 2 giant cardboard boxes and put them down. It was a most bizarre experience. So this is the moment we have to take the hawks out of the box to check that the ring numbers on their legs, they're all captive bred, matched with the paperwork. It's all a bureaucracy in hawk breeding. Another hinge untied. Concentration, infinite caution, daylight irrigating the box, scratching talons, another thump, and another thump. The air turned syrupy, slow, flecked with dust, the last few seconds before a battle, and with the last bow pulled free, he reached inside, and amidst a whirring, chaotic clatter of wings and feet and talons and a high-pitched twittering, and it's all happening at once. The man pulls an enormous, enormous hawk out of the box, and in a strange coincidence of world and deed, a great flood of sunlight drenches us, and everything is brilliance and fury. The hawk's wings barred and beating, the sharp fingers of her dark-tipped primaries cutting the air, her feathers raised like the scattered quills of a fretful porpentine. 2 enormous eyes. My heart jumps sideways. She's a conjuring trick, a reptile, a fallen angel, a griffin from the pages of an illuminated bestiary, something bright and distant like gold falling through water, a broken marionette of wings, legs, and light-splashed feathers. She's wearing jesses and the man holds them. For one awful long moment, she's hanging head downward, wings open like a turkey in a butcher's shop, only her head is turned right way up, and she's seeing more than she has ever seen before in her whole short life. Her world was an aviary no larger than a living room. Then it was a box. But now it is this, and she can see everything, the point source glitter on the waves, a diving cormorant 100 yards out, pigment flakes under wax on the lines of parked cars, far hills and the heather on them, and miles of sky where the sun spreads on dust and water, and illegible things moving in it that are white scraps of gulls. Everything is startling and new stamped on her entirely astonished brain.
A lovely passage. Did you keep a diary or a journal while you were?
I did. I started. Sorry, it's fiddle with the microphone. I started writing after my father died. Generally, keeping a diary. It was not as much a diary, more a way of sort of stitching the world back together, or making a world I could live in. The world had become unrecognizable, and then that world suddenly had a hawk in it. So I wrote about the hawk as well. But it was very strange when I wrote the book. I didn't go back to those pieces of writing as much as I thought I would, because something very odd happened to my recall. I can remember most of that year as clear as if it was yesterday. I mean, I can't remember what I was doing yesterday, but I can remember that year perfectly. I remember even sitting under a tree in a rainstorm, looking at the beads of water on the hawk's head, and I can even remember the shapes of the leaves under my feet. So I think this talking about seeing, this sort of sense that's the Ruskinian thing of, the important thing is to see. The seeing was given to me. It's all still there. And that made writing the book a very strange experience.
Did that emerge partly because of the qualities you need to train a goshawk? I mean, are the qualities you need to be a good falconer in any way related to the qualities you need to be a good writer?
Oh, that's a fantastically good question. Frederick II of Hohenstaufen would have said you need to be very, very active and be able to sort of vault ditches and ride a horse. I can't do any of those things. Yes, a kind of attention to how the world looks and a kind of patience. When I was writing the book, I was surprised. I mean, I'm really fascinated by your description of writing a book, Marion, as being a little bit like moving objects, sculptural objects around and putting them in places where they speak to one another. For me, writing the book was like training a hawk. It became a sort of half-alive thing, and it resisted me. And as I wrote, bits would refuse to behave, and I'd have to kind of put them aside and move on. So that sense that the book was almost a living thing was astonishing when I was writing it, yeah.
You're right, it was as ruinous in a way as if I'd taken a needle and shot myself with heroin about this, taking on this task.
Yes.
Well, it becomes a kind of addiction and a kind of plight for you as well.
It does. I mean, it was a way of, I say in the book that the hawk was everything I wanted to be. It was free from grief. It was completely numb to the hurts of human life. It lived in its eternal present. And also it was very ferocious. And what became my obsession, became my addiction, was to go out with the hawk once she was flying free and follow her as she hunted like a wild hawk. And the landscape was, something happened to the way I saw the world. I stopped being grief-stricken. I stopped being me. I saw the world as this incredibly detailed, patterned place of kind of, and the lines of sort of desire and force that drew me across the landscape were ones that I saw in the hawk. So I sort of became a half-human, half-hawk kind of individual. It was a radical unanchoring from the world. And it made me quite depressed towards the end. I really had neglected all the things in my life that kept me sane, really.
Your book is very conspicuously in dialogue with another book. I mean,
yes.
Or having a conversation, I think you describe it as, with T.H. White's book. That had always been an important book for you, had it?
It had, and it had infuriated me as a child. I was an incredibly self-opinionated, nightmarish sort of child, and I read this book by this chap who didn't know how to train a hawk, which was T.H. White. And I didn't understand why any grown-up would write a book about something he didn't know how to do. And I watched this terrible episodes of him trying to train this goshawk while not really knowing what he was doing and sort of torturing it. It was an incredibly tragic book. And much later I realized that the hawk was really a way of him fighting the things in himself that he found difficult to master or constantly suppressed. Sort of, he saw the hawk as being very...
releasing by proxy.
Exactly, it's a kind of incredible kind of negotiation. So the hawk was sort of a sadistic fey presence for him, so he was fighting those things in himself. But I mean, the book at heart, I think, is something about it is about the attempt to put yourself in other minds. And one of those minds is the inhuman mind of the hawk and the lure of doing that. And the other one is a sort of slightly more, in a much more difficult and conflicting kind of way. I tried to put myself in the mind of T.H. White, a man who I have enormous problems with. You know, he was a very difficult character. But that became a fascinating thing to try and do.
Was it a difficult book to have hovering over you? I mean, were you sort of conscious of his style and either reacting to it or...
Not his style. There's an incredible bit where, in one of her letters, where the biographer of T.H. White, Sylvia Townsend Warner, describes going to his house and being haunted by him in his possessions, in his objects. And there was a sense, particularly when I went to Texas and read all of his unpublished diaries and journals and materials there, that I started to get a very spooky feeling that he was standing behind me looking over my shoulder. It was incredibly disquieting. So yeah, I'm a little bit of me is quite glad. I feel a lot of compassion for the young White. He had a horrendous childhood. He was horribly abused by his parents and at school. But at the same time, I have enormous relief that I've put him down now.
Unlike Marion, you wrote your book a long time after. I mean, seven years, I think.
That's 5 or 6 years.
Did you have to wait that long? You couldn't have done it before.
I did, yes. I needed that space, and I needed that space in which I could weirdly inhabit the character, the narrator of the book, but also she wasn't me. She was me then. And that was a very weird experience, and it was a little bit like going underwater in a swimming pool or in a lake. You know, you sort of stumbled upstairs to my desk, you know, eat my pizza and get back to the computer and take a deep breath and go back to that time. It was a piece of imaginative time traveling to sort of...
And was it painful to travel back, or was it consolatory to work on?
It was painful at the time, but oddly, you know, people sort of have said to me, has it laid things to rest? And I sort of said, no, it's just, you know, finished it, you know, it's done, I finished a book. But I think it has. It feels like a reckoning and a goodbye, and I'm happy that it's out there.
Did you find it consolatory, Marion, the writing, either at the time or later?
I think yes, because when I was kind of pulling it together, making it a book, it was, you know, it was after Tom's death, and so it was a very, very desolate time. So in fact, it was like creating a sort of space where my mind could go, because it wasn't going to do anything else, you know, and also a way of viewing the extraordinary time that we had, because even though it was a total catastrophe, it was also really extraordinary. So it was a kind of view. It was a rather amazing thing to. You had this space. Here was the book, and you could, like, again, a sort of power thing somehow.
You're nodding as though you recognise.
Well, I just want to ask. I mean, one of the things that I was. Did you find that there was a sort of compassion for yourself when you wrote about those times? That
compassion for myself.
Well,
she doesn't know what
that
means. Got no idea.
I'm sorry, I'm doing the interviewing. This is terrible.
No, I'm interested. Carry on. That's good. Yeah.
But when you're writing about something that you've been through in that unit that was incredibly difficult,
yeah.
and then you're writing about yourself or writing through yourself again, and it must be a strange sort of way of looking. I mean, I felt that strange telescoping of.
Well, the whole thing was so strange anyway. It was like nothing made any sense. It wasn't like there was no normal. Do you know what I mean? So I might as well just sit down and write.
I've got you to start doing the interviewing, and I'm going to let you do some of the interviewing. We don't have ages, but if anybody wants to ask a question, if you could put your hand up, but if you could just wait for a microphone to come to you, that would help us. Everybody's shy the first time. Yes, over there. Sorry, if you could just wait for the microphone to come to you.
Hello. I was listening to Neil McGregor this morning on the radio doing one of those wonderful broadcasts about Germany, talking about it through its objects, or through objects he associated with different aspects of the history. And Marion has talked about objects here tonight, and Caroline talked about the unreliability of human testimony. I'm just thinking about other things like Edmund de Waal following a group of objects through some remarkable periods of history, and about somebody like Grayson Perry making objects that tell his story. Do you think the object is becoming more important in this type of writing? And the object as a sort of as a primary document rather than the unreliability of a human testimony that might come a long time after the event?
Alison, you were mostly working without objects, weren't you? You had a kind of
some
ornamental donkey, but...
I had some, I think it's a very good question, but I had one or two objects, and I think what makes an object resonant is sort of behind your question. And I had, for instance, a dictionary, a tiny pocket dictionary that had belonged to my father's father, who was a bricklayer, and he had kept it from the 20s and kept it together with masking tape of the sort that glaziers use, and kept rewriting his name on the spine. And he was a man who had left school early and so on. And that dictionary came to me after my father died, and I still have it. And in fact, I wanted to find out just how unlettered, as it were, my grandfather had been, and indeed then discovered he'd come from an extremely literate Baptist community that he'd broken away from. So the little dictionary, I took a photograph of it for the book, and, you know, kind of used the objects that I had to shape, to think about the accumulation of memory, and how actually the object doesn't have to be expensive. I had a tiny memorial card made of paper for somebody. It's not that makes an object important. It's what we invest in it too, and how it's travelled through time.
I don't know whether you had an object which was a living object.
I had a hawk. And one of the disturbing things about goshawks in particular is the things that they've been used to display in various cultures. So, you know, hawks are very odd historical objects. They remain the same for thousands of years. People have trained them for 5,000, 6,000 years, and their meanings have kind of been oddly robust in that time. They tend to stand for certain things to do with power, to do with the power of life and death over others, and a lot of very dark things. So one of the things I discovered while researching the book was that the chap who sent T.H. White his goshawk was a man called Rensweiler, and Rensweiler supplied Hermann Goering with a goshawk. And there's an enormously problematic, to say the least, history of fascination with falconry in Nazi Germany. And I'm kind of wrestling with this sense of birds of prey, of these objects which are used as mirrors of our own needs, and how the hawk for me was an idiosyncratic individual organism, animal, a bird, a friend, even a playfellow, or as a 16th century falconer would say, but at the same time stood, somehow there was a sort of shadow behind her of all these other meanings. So a bird is never just a bird, and it was very interesting to build a book and a story around part of that story.
And Marion, I don't know how you feel about this, but you write very vividly about objects, about the sofas in your house, about the light coming through.
Absolutely, they're all, there they are. You can look at them, you can think about them, you can have a whole, aggregation of thoughts around them. I mean, I very much wanted to put, there are sort of art objects which I talk about, paintings or works, which in a way stud the book. And some of them are things we met on the way, because of course, Tom was an art critic, he that's what he was doing all the time. So some of those, they're kind of used as sort of punctuation points, but quite often the works, the objects are brought in as ways of, as objects to think through, as objects to kind of illuminate, to send you off in a kind of, to open things out. But they did have quite specific functions. It was quite interesting, and there were initially more, and I took some out. It was like, I don't know, is it crowd? I don't know. There's a sense of, well, again, it's partly to do with the book and the words, and things are physical. How do you describe the physical? What does it mean to look at the clock? What does it mean to see the people? There's a kind of sort of physicality of it. So I think objects are very vital in that, you know, and you can talk about them, and you can describe them, and there they are.
Okay, there was a question down here.
Thank you. I wonder if John would like to say something more about Jenkins, over here, Jenkins the politician, you know, perhaps his time in Europe or something along those lines, but also any of the other authors who want, if there was something else in particular that they felt they hadn't had an opportunity to talk about, that they might wish to just say something. Thank you.
What would Roy Jenkins have thought about UKIP? I mean, that question came to me.
That wasn't my question.
No, I know, I'm sorry. But it's because you asked about Europe.
Yes, I think you can know what Roy Jenkins would have thought about UKIP, but I think there is a curious sense, opposite though they are. Sorry, I'm answering your question about UKIP, but UKIP, although diametrically different from the SDP, is arousing some of the same sort of anti-politics or fresh start in politics enthusiasm that the SDP in a very different way did 30 years ago. I wouldn't want to push the comparison too far, but otherwise, no, politically, clearly, I mean, most of my book is political history. Jenkins was there, very closely involved. He's a protege of Attlee at the beginning, went on to be a mentor of Tony Blair at the end, over 50 years. His story, part of the point of my book is that his career spans that whole period of British politics, and particularly Labour Party politics, in which he was very closely involved all the way through. So I hope it's more than just a biography. I think there is a lot of, I hope, good political history in it as well.
Did that answer your question? Or I wanted to ask one question. I was very interested reading the reviews. I haven't read all of the reviews of your book, but there was a very funny tendency that if the reviewer was at all politically affiliated, their review essentially said, this is a wonderful book, and the reason it's wonderful is because essentially Roy Jenkins agrees with me, or proves that I was right all along.
I think most of the reviewers chosen were fairly sympathetic to him in the first place. I mean, there could have been much more hostile reviewers. If they'd got sort of Dennis Skinner to review it, it would have been a different matter. Or quite a lot of other, I think most of the reviewers did think he was quite a good egg, and that reflected the tenor of the reviews perhaps to my advantage.
I don't know whether anybody else wanted to add something that you didn't get a chance to say on that question then. Yes, there's a question just behind there.
First of all, I'd like to say what an utterly fascinating evening and how well it was chaired and how we got the feeling of the books. But I'm interested in your idea about the planes and the hawks because, I come from a family in which all the men are crazy about planes and I was constantly dragged along. But in later life, I realised that flying, being free to fly without an engine, a bit like, the early days of the Spitfire had immense power and vision, and those are the two things I would see as the freedom and endless. You can go anywhere in a way that planes really are a bit sort of limited. So I think that's kind of an interesting
It is. It's
connection.
A very interesting area, and it's something I talk about a little in the book. There's an extraordinary line by W.H. Auden, the beginning of a poem written in 1930. He says, "Consider this, or in our time, as the hawk sees it, or the helmeted airman." And I think this sense of kind of transcendence, a kind of sense that you're flying above the messy realities of sort of mud of human lives, and you can take the kind of global view down on it, is a kind of it's an incredibly strong theme through a lot of writing on hawks and on aeroplanes right through the 20th century and before in terms of hawks. And there's a sort of weird way in which aeroplanes and hawks get melded, particularly in the Second World War, into dreams of sort of romantic nationalism. As I touched on before, this can have quite dark kind of ramifications, and very dark in some cases. And I think towards the end of the book, I talk a little bit about thinking about my father, who was this obsessive plane spotter as a boy. He used to get on his bicycle with his bottle of Tizer and cycle, 20 miles to aerodromes, as they were known then, and stand for 12 hours watching planes. And I never really understood it until after he died, and I realized that there's a kind of escape there. If you identify with these planes, you know that they're going to snowy airfields in Russia or wherever, You know, if you know what they are and know their numbers, you can kind of fly with them. So in a sense, the book is about death in that sense of the final journey as well, and that all those things mesh together. So thank you.
Yes, there's one question. I think we've got time for one more question, perhaps two, but certainly one here.
Thank you. I am your live tweeter, so I was going to ask a question from the internet. The internet is not forthcoming, so I will ask my own question instead. I'm currently attempting to write my grandmother's memoirs, and aside from the difficulties of translating North Italian dialect into English, which is difficult, I wondered if anyone had any reflections on how it feels to have a story run away from you. So it started out as my grandmother's story, and now it's very much becoming my grandfather's story, although he's dead, and the story of the women of my family. So she started out as the subject, and she no longer is the subject, she's just the narrator. And it felt from some of the things that you said that you might have some reflections on that.
Alison, you certainly write very explicitly about the sense of your book running away with you, or running into areas you didn't expect it to go.
Yes, I mean, I suspect that what I would say may well match what other people would say, which is ruthless shaping, and how one goes about that is hard work. It's not a very cheering message. I mean, I think you let it run away with you, and then you see where it's gone, and whether it's a history, whether it's a sort of mix, which my book is, a biography, I mean, my feeling is that everybody on the platform, maybe, you know, feels what you're doing is shaping and forming and composing, and that frees you, and then it becomes an object. And I think you'll find your way. You just go on doing it until you can't do any more, and it becomes that tension between expression and control, which is probably at the heart of all art, actually, if I can sound rather pompous.
Karen, do you want to add to that?
The same thing, and it sort of develops, and it'll take you a little bit in one direction, and then it'll guide you in another, and it has a life of its own often.
Were you startled by directions in which the book went?
No.
You were in control all the way?
Yes.
Or, yeah.
Well, I don't know. I mean, I was sort of writing a book. Yeah, I mean, when you took those breaths of air and went underwater, you could end up anywhere. And there were bits where I struggled with how I would integrate the story of White and the story of my own kind of experiences with the hawk, and some of those bits kind of. But I wanted the book to have different voices. I've always, part of the book is nature writing, and I guess I liked the sense that you had different voices that weren't just the expert voice of the sort of expert on nature or the expert on human life or whatever, but they'd have sort of White's voice and my hawk's voice and my voice, and all those things got very messy. And I just had to cross my fingers and hope that it would turn out all right. But I think, you know, I had that year, I had that chronology to work with, whereas I can imagine if you're working on something which is much more open-ended, it's quite hard to kind of wrestle with that.
John, I think you get the last word here. I mean, a biography gives you a shape anyway.
Yes, I mean,
it?
I had the chronology to work with, as you say. I mean, my problem, I knew where the story was going. I had an enormous amount of material. It was just a question of shaping it into a narrative with a certain amount of analysis and judgment along the way. But yes, I mean, really, biography. Mine's the most conventional book, I suppose, of the five on the panel. It does have a given beginning, middle, and end. And all I had to do, what I had to do was shape it.
Yes, I wouldn't dismiss it that lightly. Well, I'm afraid we have run out of time. I've overrun. I'm sorry, I've hogged time for our questions. Thank you for the questions you did ask. Apologies if you didn't get time to ask yours. There is one more opportunity because all of the books are on sale outside and the authors will be signing them. So if you can ask a question and get it answered in the time that your name can be signed, you've got an opportunity. Before that, if you could just join me really in thanking all of the authors for their contribution to tonight's session and wishing them all the best for tomorrow night.